I am Farhan Shaikh, grade 12. Joining me today is Issam Qureshi, grade 10, a student with a sharp analytical mind and a deep interest in economic history. Welcome, Issam.
Thank you, Farhan. It's a privilege to be here.
Today we are examining one of the most catastrophic economic collapses in modern history, the Great Depression. Issam, when you hear the phrase hidden causes of the Great Depression, what immediately comes to your mind?
When I hear the phrase, I think of all the explanations that don't make it into the simplified textbook versions. Most people know it started with the stock market crash of 1929. But that was just a symptom, not that the cause. I've always wondered what really triggered it. And more importantly, could it happen again today?
Hmm. That is precisely the heart of our discussion today, Sam. The Great Depression is often presented as a tragic but isolated event, a perfect storm that could never repeat. But as we'll discover today, its underlying causes are not only still present but in some ways amplified. We will examine it through three lenses: the structural weaknesses that had created the collapse, the policy failures that deepened it, and the uncomfortable question of whether we are truly safe from another one. Isam, let us begin with a simple question. In your textbooks, what is given as the primary cause of the Great Depression?
So basically, in our textbooks, our curriculum, the stock market crash of October 1929, Black Tuesday, everyone was speculating, buying stocks on margin, borrowing money they didn't have. When confidence collapsed, so did the market. Banks failed, people lost their savings, and then the whole economy spiraled downwards. The graph plummeted.
Hmm. A textbook answer, and not entirely wrong, in fact, but it is dangerously incomplete. Isam, let me ask you this. If the crash was the cause, why didn't the supermarket crash of 1987, which was proportionately even more severe, trigger another depression?
That's actually a really, really good question, Farhan. I've never actually thought about it. So there must be been other factors, it's deeper structural issues that made the crash catastrophic in reality.
Hmm. Exactly, Sam. The crash was a spark, but the fire had already been built over decades. Let me outline three hidden causes that textbooks often gloss over. First, agricultural overproduction and falling farm prices. Throughout the 1920s, American farmers were producing more food than the population could consume. Mechanization, tractors, harvesters had dramatically increased output, but demand didn't keep pace. Farm prices collapsed throughout the decade. By 1929, one in four farms in the United States were being sold for debt. Isam, what does that tell you?
That tells me that the economy was already struggling. You know, the long before the stock market crash, the economy was already very deep down, suffering in places we couldn't identify. The crash didn't cause the farm crisis or whatever you spoke about. The farm crisis was already happening, and if the farmers couldn't pay their debts, banks were already in trouble.
Precisely, and this brings us to the second hidden cause, the banking system itself. In the 1920s, there were over 25,000 individual banks in the United States. Many were small, poorly capitalized, and uninsured. When farm debts went bad, rural banks failed. When the stock market crashed, urban banks with stock investments failed. And here's a crucial point: there was no federal deposit insurance. Isam, what happens when you have no deposit insurance and a bank fails?
That question, Farhan, is the exact this question, the answer to this question is going to outline the reason why empires fall. You see, you lose everything. People panic. They rush to withdraw their money from other banks, even healthy ones. So, a bank run, and that creates a chain reaction. Bank after bank collapse, collapse, collapse. And this is the reason empires collapse because people panic, they withdraw their money too quickly, even from healthy banks, and it's like a chain reaction that goes on and on like a domino effect.
Exactly. More than 9,000 banks failed between 1930 and 1933 some. But there's a third hidden cause that is rarely discussed: the gold standard. Isam, can you explain what that was?
So the gold standard was actually it was a system where every country's currency was backed by a fixed amount of gold. So every currency, a unit of currency is backed by a fixed constant amount of gold. You could exchange paper money for gold at a fixed constant ratio or rate. It was supposed to create stability, but it also prevented governments, prevented governments from printing more money or lowering interest rates to stimulate the economy.
Excellent. And here is the critical point. When the depression began, countries on the gold standard couldn't easily expand their money supply to rescue failing banks or stimulate spending. Instead, they were forced to raise interest rates to protect their gold reserves, which only made the depression worse. Isam, what does this tell us about the interplay of these three factors?
They all fed into each other. That's all. Farm failures led to bank failures led to panic. The gold standard prevented the government from stepping in to stop the collapse. It wasn't one cause, it was a cascade of vulnerabilities that all triggered each other, a chain reaction we would never identify.
Exactly. The Great Depression wasn't caused by one event, it was caused by a system that was fundamentally unstable. Isam, let us now discuss the policy failures that deepened the crisis. Many people believe the depression was an inevitable catastrophe, but in reality, government actions made it significantly worse. Let me introduce you to two key examples.
Yeah, I'm listening.
First, the Smooth Hawley Tariff of 1930. This was a protectionist law that raised tariffs on thousands of imported goods. The intention was to protect American industries from foreign competition. But here's the question, Assam. What happens when one country raises its tariffs?
If I answer this question precisely to the point, other countries retaliate. That's all. They raise their own tariffs and suddenly international trade collapses. It's actually counter attack.
Exactly. And that's precisely what happened, Assam. Global trade fell by nearly two-thirds between 1929 and 1934. American exports plummeted. American industries that relied on exporting goods were devastated. The tariff didn't protect the economy, Assam. It shattered one of its remaining lifelines.
So the government's attempt to actually help made things worse.
Significantly worse. And there's a second policy failure, the Federal Reserve's response to the banking crisis. Isam, what is the role of a central bank during a financial panic?
Basically, the role of a central bank, as I speak, central bank, during financial panic is basically to act as a lender of last resort, to provide liquidity to banks so they don't fail, to prevent bank runs by reassuring the public that their money is safe. And the term I use, liquidity, here is how fast you can change an asset into money, into real cash, without it losing significant value. So if I reframe my sentence, when you know the meaning of liquidity, the central bank's last job is to act as a lender and to provide liquidity to banks so they don't fall, to prevent bank runs by reassuring the public that their money is safe.
Perfect answer, Sam. But the Federal Reserve did the opposite. In the early 1930s, instead of injecting money into the banking system, they allowed the money supply to contract by nearly 30%. Isam, what happens when the money supply shrinks dramatically?
Deflation. Prices fall, people in businesses can't repay their debts because the value of money increases. It's devastating. And if the money supply shrinks by 30%, you'd see massive unemployment and widespread business failure, all because of deflation.
That is exactly what happened, Assam. Unemployment reached 25% by 1933. Industrial production fell by nearly half. The Federal Reserve, which was created precisely to prevent such a crisis, actually deepened it through inaction.
That's shocking, Farhan. That is shocking. So the depression wasn't just a market failure. It was also a failure of governance. This is the heart of the entire podcast we are having here. the depression wasn't at all a market failure. It was just inaction and a failure of government policies.
Precisely, Isam, you're right. And this leads us to the third part of a discussion, Isam. Could it happen again? Isam, we have established that the Great Depression was caused by structural vulnerabilities and policy failures. The natural question is, have we learned our lessons? Could it happen again?
I'd like to think we have learned, but I am not sure. We have deposit insurance now, which prevents bank runs. We have the Federal Reserve, which usually knows to inject liquidity into the market during crisis. We are no longer on the gold standard, so governments can stimulate the economy. That would make us safe, as per what I keep as the zenith point. My point of view says that we have everything. Injection of liquidity, gold standards doesn't exist, right governance to stimulate the economy, everything's perfect. I don't really think so that makes us vulnerable to the next depression.
Yeah, those all points are valid, Isam. And indeed, these reforms have made a repeat of the 1930s less likely. But let us examine why we are not entirely safe.
Okay, okay, let's see.
First, the agricultural crisis hasn't disappeared. It has simply moved to a global scale. In the 1920s, American farmers were overproducing. Today, we have global overproduction in many sectors. China's manufacturing capacity, for example, far exceeds global demand. Isam, what happens when the world produces more than it can consume?
Market forces work in a way we have not fully understood, but this part can be understood by a 5-year-old child also. When the supply of a particular commodity is way, way, way more than its demand, like in this case, prices fall, producers go bankrupt. If it's widespread enough, entire economies can be destabilized.
Exactly. The structural problem of overproduction hasn't been solved. It's been exported to the global level. Secondly, our financial system has become infinitely more complex. In the 1920s, the problem was thousands of small, uninsured banks. Today, we have enormous financial institutions that are too big to fail. Isam, what happens if one of these institutions collapse?
That's a really good question. So, it could trigger a global financial crisis. If I say precisely, not exaggerating, it could trigger a global financial crisis. If a bank is so large that its failure threatens the entire system, if an institution is so large, its failure threatens the existence of entire systems that have been created all over the world, the government has no choice, but to bail it out. But that creates a moral hazard. Banks take bigger risks because they know they'll be saved.
Exactly. And in 2008, we saw precisely this dynamic play out. But here's the difference. In 2008, governments and central banks acted quickly with massive stimulus. They prevented a depression. Isam, what happens if the next crisis is too big for governments to handle?
Then we could see a collapse. Obviously, we see a collapse on a scale we haven't experienced since the 1930s. And with global debt levels much higher now in than in 1929, today the debt levels are so high the dominoes could fall faster and harder, crushing entire economies.
Thirdly, the gold standard is gone, which is a protection, but we have created new vulnerabilities: global supply chain dependencies, hyper financialization, and massive sovereign debt. Isam, can you think of any modern vulnerabilities that could trigger a depression?
I leave all the mathematical and complex we see in our everyday life. Climate change could cause massive disruptions, crop failures, displacement of populations, infrastructure destruction. All of this could trigger economic shocks or a pandemic like COVID showed us how quickly global supply chains can break. If a shock is big enough, even modern safeguards might never ever be enough.
That is an astute observation, Isam. The Great Depression's hidden lesson is not that one event caused it. The lesson is that complex systems can fail catastrophically when multiple vulnerabilities align. And our system today is arguably more complex than ever. Now, Isam, we have covered a great deal. The structural weaknesses of the 1920s economy, the policy failures that turned a recession into a depression, and the modern vulnerabilities that could, under the right conditions, trigger another collapse. Let me ask you a final question, Isam. Why does this matter, especially for someone your age?
Because if we don't understand the failures of the past, we don't recognize the warning signs of the future. It's impossible. Every generation thinks that their crisis is different. That's a dangerous arrogance we live in. We study the Great Depression not because it's curiosity, but because it's a warning. And I don't want to be able to see the storm coming before it arrives.
That is a remarkable answer. Let me add to it. Understanding these hidden causes makes us less vulnerable. The Great Depression was not inevitable, it was a result of choices and policies. And if we choose differently, we can avoid a repeat, but only if we have the wisdom to learn.
That gives the lesson. History isn't just about the past, it's about preparing for the future.
Exactly, Sam. History is not a collection of dead facts, it is a living conversation across generations. And now you're part of it, Sam. What is your final takeaway for our listeners?
That the Great Depression was not caused by one single crash. It's not a single factor phenomena. It was caused by decades of ignored vulnerabilities and catastrophic policy failures. The warning signs were there, but no one acted. And the most dangerous thing we can do today is believe that it could never happen. This Ozymandias irony is will and can possibly cause the next Great Depression. The most dangerous thing we can do today is believe it could never happen again because that's exactly what people believed in 1928.
Powerful conclusion. I am Farhan Shaikh, grade 12.
And I'm Issam Qureshi, grade 10.
Thank you for listening to the Time Travelers podcast. Thank you.